So the Kremlin is saying Russia is hoping President Trump's phone conversations with Vladimir Putin will not be made public after the White House declassified the transcript of the call, or partially did so, of the call with the Ukrainian president following the whistleblower complaint alleging Mr. Trump's abuse of power. The Wall Street Journal, he has a headline, "Embarrassing leaks led to clamp down on President Trump's phone records." Dan Hoffman is here. He is a former CIA station chief who served in Moscow, Iraq, and Pakistan, and now is a Fox News contributor. Always good to have you here, Dan.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So why would the Kremlin not want calls between President Trump and President Putin made public?
So first, if the Kremlin wanted them to be made public, I'm sure that they would find a way to do so, whether by leaking them or stating the records of the transcripts publicly. But what they really want to do is to inject a little bit of conspiracy into our public discourse. They know that if they express an opinion, if the Kremlin says that those transcripts shouldn't be released, then that's a little bit of ammunition for the president's opponents, who will argue, in fact, that they should be released. And, of course, the Republicans and the president will push back, and once again, Russia will become the fodder for the hyper-partisan political debate that serves, frankly, Vladimir Putin's interests.
So President Putin doesn't care about President Trump. Putin's goal is world dominance, right?
Well, yeah, KGB operative in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, his primary enemy is the United States. And what scares him the most is democracy, and he wants to take every opportunity to disparage our democratic process. And that's really what this is all about.
But does that bring up another concern of the people who feel that what they have seen in the summary of the phone conversation with Ukraine President Zelensky and President Trump, is that the very thing that some of the critics are concerned in, that perhaps someone like President Putin could blackmail President Trump, knowing that he perhaps, as according to some, it is wait to get the results on this, but according to some, that the president abused his power as president over the Ukrainian president?
Yeah, there's a number of reasons why phone calls between the president of the United States and foreign presidents are typically shared widely. And one of them is that they typically don't discuss classified information on the phone call. Another is that the president needs his own team, intelligence community, diplomats, the military, to take a look at the phone call and then act on what the president is seeking to deliver with that foreign leader. And the third reason is that others as well may be listening in on that phone call or collecting intelligence on what transpired. I'm quite sure that for Vladimir Putin, it's very important to track exactly how the president of the United States is interacting with President Zelensky of the Ukraine. And so there would be some concern that Russia would have known the details of that conversation.
Does the president have the discretion to place transcripts of calls with foreign leaders on that code word super secret server?
I think that's something the Congress will be digging into in the coming days, because apparently it was the National Security Council lawyers who made a decision that that was something the president could do. I just know from my own experience, again, at CIA, there was a need to know, and the details of the president's phone calls with foreign leaders were kept to the minimum number of people required, but there was a good bit of sharing just so that we could act on the president's tasking appropriately.
So with subpoena power on their side, the Democrats now with the impeachment inquiry, can the White House or the administration refuse at this point to submit the complete unredacted version of that call on July 25th?
I think it's a challenge, and I say this as someone who served for many years at the CIA, where one of our mantras is that the secret of our success is the secret of our success. And the United States happens to be a wide-open democracy with separation of powers and freedom of the press, and there's a tremendous amount of pressure, and rightly so, that we are as transparent as possible. And when you've got an active whistleblower complaint out there, which is going to lead to further investigation, I think it's awfully hard to keep the details of this one secret.
Anything in that call concerns you?
I think Ukraine, what concerns me the most is Ukraine's probably the last place I'd be going to for information about corruption, just given that the state of Ukraine is one of the most corrupt places on the planet. And I would be very wary of trusting the veracity of any information I might receive from anyone. I don't know that I want to get tangled up in that mess there.
I'm sorry, Dan, but do you believe, though, that the new president, President Zelensky, that's what he ran and won on, that he wants to get rid of corruption in their system? So does that lend credibility at all to what he's saying in his exchange in that phone call?
So President Zelensky won on a very populist platform and mandate. The problem is that he's got to manage a country which is overrun with endemic corruption, and there's been a lot of concern about an oligarch in Ukraine, Igor Kolomoisky, who operates the television station where Kolomoisky's TV sitcom was running. And Kolomoisky, by all accounts, is seeking to use the government of Ukraine not only to exact revenge on his enemies, but also to enrich his own pockets. And so the jury's out on the extent to which President Zelensky is going to fulfill his campaign promise. It's certainly in the interests of all of us that Ukraine is corruption-free. If they're corrupt, they're easily exploited by Russia and not likely to join the European Union or NATO, which are their goals.
So your only concern, wrapping up, so far of what you've seen in that, what was said in that phone call, the summary that we've seen, your only concern was that the president, that you were more concerned about corruption in Ukraine, not so much what the president said to President Zelensky, our president.
Well, I think all of us are concerned about the whole story, and I think it'll be up to the Congress to complete the fact-finding. And frankly, there's a lot of facts out there that we don't really know quite yet. So I think it's a good thing for all of us to reserve our judgment, final judgment on how we view this, and let the Congress do their job.
We leave it there, Dan Hoffman. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Take care.